So you have a floating trem system like a Floyd Rose and it won't tune. When you tune up one string, all the other strings fall flat. Fear not, my friends, because this is a common problem, and in this video, I'm gonna get your trem shred ready. Also, stick around to the end for some serious savings on some guitar pedals and audio gear. All right, this is the axe, let's go! All right guys, welcome back. For those of you that are new, my name is Nick. Floating trems like a Floyd Rose can be a fickle bitch if you don't understand them completely. I mean, it's a complicated guitar system that allows you to do complicated things. There's a lot of moving pieces, not only with the mechanism itself, but with the tension balance between the strings that are on the top of the guitar and the springs that are in the back rear cavity. A quick floating trem anatomy lesson for review. You have the floating tremolo itself, the studs, and the knife edges. Saddles, saddle screws, fine tuning screws, and sustain block. The floating trem has two sources of tension, which is the strings pulling on the trem this way, and the springs located in the back and the rear cavity that are attached to the sustain block pulling the trem the other way. These two sources of tension need to be equalized over a central fulcrum, which are the knife edges that sit upon the studs. Now, while each individual spring in the back rear cavity provides a near identical amount of tension, this isn't the same case with the strings on the other side. First off, each individual string provides its own level of tension against the springs in the back. For instance, the higher the gauge, like your low E string, provides more tension against the trem than your high E string. Furthermore, each individual string's tuning depends on the equilibrium of tension of the other strings. For example, say you tune up one of the strings on the floating tremolo and all the other strings drop drastically in pitch. This is happening because the string that you tuned up, you gave more tension, is actually pulling up the trem slightly and slacking all the other strings, causing them to drop in pitch and become flat. This brings us to our first most common problem that you're probably experiencing, and that is a simple tension mismatch. So if you're tuning your Floyd Rose and you're individually going through each string like you should, and you just can't get the other ones to stay in tune, they keep dropping flat, it's likely that you need increased tension in the rear cavity, aka the springs. Usually the best and most efficient way to do this is to, hold on, I know it's scary because you're screwing deeper into your guitar, but to tighten the tremolo claw screws. Tightening these screws adds a little bit of tension to the trem springs, allowing the overall trem and balance to reach equilibrium to meet the actual tension of the strings. This works the same if you're having the reverse problem too. If you're having to tune your strings so sharply to get the actual trem to be level and come up, then you actually need to pull back on those claw screws so you can actually release some tension to get equilibrium. And just some reassurance, guys, as a guitar tech, I've adjusted several tremolo claw screws and I've never had one strip, rip out, or damage the body of a guitar, so go at it. Another way to address a tension mismatch or loose tension in the back is to replace the springs with new springs or get heavy duty springs. Springs do get weak over time, and sometimes your string setup does require heavier duty noiseless springs. I personally recommend the heavy duty noiseless springs from FU Tone. I'll put the link in the description. These are phenomenal. They fit almost every trem and they last forever. Now, the second most common problem that's likely causing your strings to go flat when you tune are a knife edge defect. Remember how the knife edge sits on that stud and kind of acts as a fulcrum? When the knife edges are really dull or damaged, it can really keep the guitar from getting in tune and staying in tune, really. Like we talked about earlier, as you tune up a single string, you change the angle of that trem just so slightly. And if those knife edges have burrs or they're damaged, they'll get locked or they won't be able to achieve a certain amount of tuning because it's not as free flowing or, free to move around. This fix can be tricky, but not impossible for everybody. If you took your trem off and you notice that there are some damage to the knife edges, make sure to see if they are replaceable, like the Ibanez Edge. I think a lot of the Ibanez trems have that. The Schaller licensed trem or the hand tug, titanium or those really high quality trems. If you can replace these, that's a quick fix. Now, if the knife edges aren't replaceable, see if the damage or the burrs can be slightly sanded away with a very high grit sandpaper. This isn't a guaranteed fix, but it's worked for me a couple times. You really have nothing to lose if your knife edges are pretty damaged. Also, side note, make sure your studs aren't ground down or damaged, because in a lot of cheaper trems, they use softer metals or even People replace trems by using different metals, and that will wear away the studs, causing your knife edges to kind of keep it from going in tune. And the last and third reason why your strings might be going out of tune and going flat is saddle damage. Now this one's a little bit more rare, and it usually occurs with like trems that you've had for years or ones that are cheaper and use, like we said earlier, softer metals. Sometimes, depending on how you use the trem or the trem itself, the strings can ground down or kind of ground a little groove into the saddle itself, which can mess with the overall tuning stability of the whole mechanism. To address this, obviously, take the strings off and shine a really bright light on each individual saddle to see if you can see a groove where the string has actually kind of ground down into the metal. If you see any shadowing or evidence of a groove, the cool thing is generally with most trems, you can replace these saddles. So you could replace like one or two or all of them if you need to. As always, guys, if you have any questions or need help with this stuff, please message me on Instagram at NickAxeGuitar or just shoot me an email. I'm always willing and happy to take your questions. People reach out to me every day and we can usually fix whatever they need just over a couple DMs. All right, now it's time to save some money and get some killer deals. I've partnered with both Mayono Audio and Legato Musical Instruments. If you need some killer microphones and things like audio interfaces, please check out mayono.com and use the code PHASE10, P-H-A-S-E 10 to save 10% off at checkout. We personally use the PD200X on the Phase Splitter podcast in this very studio, and they work phenomenally. All right, guys, this is the end of the video. I hope it helps, and if you haven't subscribed already, consider doing so you don't miss any content like this. Later, guys.